Und wenn es glückt, und wenn es sich schickt, so sind es Gedanken. My research has led me to the realization that repetition automatism, Wiederholungsdrang, has its basis in what I call the insistence of the signifying chain. I have isolated this notion as a correlate of the existence, that is, of the eccentric place, in which we must necessarily locate the subject of the unconscious if we are to take Freud's discovery seriously. As we know, it is in the experience inaugurated by psychoanalysis that we can grasp by what oblique imaginary means the symbolic takes hold in even the deepest recesses of the human organism. The teaching of this seminar is designed to maintain that imaginary effects, far from representing the core of analytic experience, give us nothing of any consistency unless they are related to the symbolic chain that binds and orients them. I am, of course, aware of the importance of the imaginary impregnation, Pragung, in the partializations of the symbolic alternative that gives the signifying chain its appearance. Nevertheless, I posit that it is the law specific to this chain which governs the psychoanalytic effects that are determinant for the subject, effects such as foreclosure, Verwirrung, repression, Verdrängung, and negation, Verneinung, itself, and I add with the appropriate emphasis that these effects follow the displacement and stellung of the signifier so faithfully that the imaginary factors, despite their inertia, figure only as shadows and reflections therein. But this emphasis would be lavish and vain if it merely served, in your view, to abstract a general form from phenomena whose particularity in analytic experience would remain the core thing to you and whose original, composite nature would be broken down only through artifice. This is why I have decided to illustrate for you today a truth which may be drawn from the moment in Freud's thought we have been studying, namely, that it is the symbolic order which is constitutive for the subject, by demonstrating in a story the major determination the subject receives from the itinerary of a signifier. It is this truth, let us note, that makes the very existence of fiction possible. Thus, a fable is as appropriate as any other story for shedding light on it, provided that we are willing to put the fable's coherence to test. With this proviso, a fable even has the advantage of manifesting symbolic necessity all more purely, in that we might be inclined to believe it is governed by the arbitrary. This is why, without looking any further, I have taken my example from the very story in which we find the dialectic of the game of even or odd, from which we very recently gleaned something of importance. It is probably no accident that the story provided propitious for the continuation of a line of research which had already relied upon it. As you know, I am referring to the tale Baudelaire translated into French as La Lettre Volée. In it we must immediately distinguish between drama and its narration, as well as the conditions of that narrative. We quickly perceive, moreover, what makes these components necessary and realize that the composer could not have created them unintentionally, for the narrative effectively doubles the drama with a commentary without which no mise en scène would be possible. Let us say that the action would remain, strictly speaking, invisible to the audience aside from the fact that the dialogue would be expressly and by dramatic necessity devoid of whatever meaning it might have for a listener. In other words, nothing of the drama could appear either in the framing of the images or the sampling of sounds without the oblique light shed, so to speak, on each scene by the narration from the point of view that one of the actors had while playing his role in it. There are two such scenes, the first of which I shall immediately designate as the primal scene, and by no means inattentively, since the second may be considered its repetition in the sense of the latter term that I have been articulating in this very seminar. The primal scene is thus performed, we are told, in the royal boudoir, such that we suspect that the personage of most exalted station, also referred to as the illustrious personage, who is alone there when she receives the letter, is the queen. This sense is confirmed by the awkward situation she is put in by the entrance of the other exalted personage, of whom we had been told prior to this account that, were he to come to know of the letter in question, it would jeopardize for the lady nothing less than her honour and peace. Any doubt that he is in fact the king is promptly dissipated in the course of the scene which begins with the entrance of Minister D, for at that moment the Queen can do no better than to take advantage of the King's inattentiveness by leaving the letter on the table, turned face down, address uppermost. This does not, however, escape the Minister's lynx eye, nor does he fail to notice the Queen's distress, and thus to fathom her secret. For then on everything proceeds like clockwork. After dealing with the business of the day with his customary speed and intelligence, the Minister draws from his pocket a letter similar in appearance to the one before his eye. After pretending to read it, places it next to the other. A bit more conversation to pull the wool over the royal's eyes, whereupon he picks up the embarrassing letter without flinching, and decamps, while the Queen, on whom none of his manoeuvre has been lost, remains unable to intervene for fear of attracting the attention of her loyal spouse, who is standing on her elbow at that very moment. An ideal spectator might have noticed nothing of this operation in which no one batted an eye, and whose quotient is that the Minister has filched from the Queen her letter and, even more important, that the Queen knows that he now has it, and by no means innocently. A remainder that no analyst will neglect, trained as he is to remember everything having to do with the signifier, even if he does not always know what to do with it. The letter left on hand by the Minister which the Queen is now free to crumple up. Second scene in the Minister's office at the Ministerial Hotel. We know from the account that the Prefect of Police is given Dupin, whose genius for solving enigmas Poe mentions here for the second time that the police have searched the hotel and its surroundings from top to bottom for the last 3 months, returning there as often as the minister's regular absences at night allows them to. In vain, however, although anyone can deduce from the situation that the minister keeps the letter within easy reach. Dupin calls on the minister. The latter greets him with a show of nonchalance, affecting in his conversation romantic ennui. Meanwhile, Dupin, who is not taken in by this feigning, inspects the premises, his eyes protected by green spectacles. When his gaze alights upon a very chafed letter, which seems to have been abandoned in the compartment of a wretched eye-catching trumpery card-rack of pasteboard hanging right smack in the middle of the mantelpiece, he already knows that he has found what he is looking for. His conviction is reinforced by the very details which seem designed to contradict the description he has been given of the stolen letter, with the exception of the size, which fits. Whereupon he has but to take his leave, after having forgotten his snuff-box on the table, in order to return the following day to reclaim it, armed with a facsimile of the letter in its present state. When an accident out in the street, prepared for the right moment, draws the minister to the window, Dupin seizes the opportunity to snatch in his turn the letter while replacing it with an imitation semblant, and need but maintain the appearances of a normal exit thereafter. Here too all that transpired is not without any sound, at least without any din. The quotient of the operation is that the minister no longer has the letter, but he knows nothing of it, and is far from suspecting that it is Dupin who ravished it from him. Moreover, what he is left with here is far from insignificant. For what follows, I shall return to what led Dupin to jot something down on his facetious letter. In any case, when the minister tries to make use of it, he will be able to read the following words, whose source, Dupin tells us, is Crébillon's écrit, written so that he may recognize Dupin's hand. Un dessin si funeste. S'il n'est digne d'être, est de tieste. Need I emphasize the resemblance between these two actions? Yes, but the similarity I have in mind is not made up of the single union of traits chosen only in order to prepare à Paris their differences. and it would not suffice to retain the traits of resemblance at the expense of the other for any truth whatsoever to result therefrom. It is, rather, the intersubjectivity by which the two actions are motivated that I wish to highlight, as well as the three terms with which that intersubjectivity structures them. These terms derive their privileged status from the fact that they correspond both to the three logical moments through which decision is precipitated and to the three places which this decision assigns to the subjects that it separates out. This decision is reached in the moment of a glance, regard. The necessary reference here may be found in my essay "Logical Time and the Assertion of Anticipated Certainty" in Eccritus 1966, page 197 to 213. For the maneuvers that follow, however stealthily that moment is prolonged in them, add nothing to it, no more than the deferral of the opportunity in the second scene disrupts the unity of that moment. This glance presupposes two others, which it assembles to provide a view of the opening left in their fallacious complementarity, anticipating there the plunder afforded by that uncovering. Thus three movements ordering three glances sustained by three subjects incarnated in each case by different people. The first is based on a glance that sees nothing, the king and then the police. The second is based on a glance which sees that the first sees nothing, and deceives itself into thereby believing to be covered what it hides, the queen and then the minister. The third is based on a glance which sees that the first two glances leave what must be hidden uncovered to whom would seize it, the minister and finally Dupin. In order to get you to grasp in its unity the intersubjective complex thus described, I would like to willingly seek patronage for it in the technique legendarily attributed to the ostrich, a Sikh, when it seeks shelter from danger. For this technique might finally be qualified as political, distributed as it is here among three partners, the second believing himself invisible because the first has his head stuck in the sand, all the while letting the third calmly pluck his rear. We need but enrich its proverbial denomination by a letter producing La politique de l'autruche, for this technique in itself to finally take on a new everlasting meaning. Having thus established the intersubjective module of the action that repeats, we now must indicate it a repetition automatism in the sense that interests us in Freud's work. The fact that we have here a plurality of subjects can, of course, in no way constitute an objection to those who are long accustomed to the perspective summarized by my formulation. The unconscious is the other's discourse. I will not remind you now what the notion of the inmixing of subjects recently introduced in my reanalysis of the dreams of Irma's injection adds here. What interests me today is the way in which subjects, owing to their displacements, relay each other in the course of the intersubjective repetition. We shall see that their displacement is determined by the place that a pure signifier, the purloined letter, comes to occupy in their trio. This is what will confirm for us that it is repetition automatism. It does not, however, seem superfluous before pursuing this line of inquiry to ask whether the aim of the tale and the interest we take in it, inasmuch as they coincide, do not lie elsewhere. Can we consider the fact that the tale is told to us as a mystery story be a simple rationalization, as we say in our crude jargon? In truth, we would be justified in considering this to be highly dubious, noting as we do that everything about a crime or offense that creates such a mystery, its nature and its motives, instruments and execution, the procedure used to discover its author, and the means employed to convict him for it, is carefully eliminated here at the beginning of each episode. Indeed, the act of deceit is as clearly known from the outset as the plotting of the culprit and its effects on his victim. The problem, as it is exposed to us, is limited to the search for the deceitfully acquired object for the purposes of restitution, and it seems quite intentional that the solution is already known when it is explained to us. Is that how we are kept in suspense? However much credit we may give to the conventions of a genre for arousing a specific interest in the reader, we should not forget that the Dupin tale, this being the second to come out, is a prototype, and that since it receives its genre only from the first, it is a little too early for the author to play on a convention. It would, however, be equally excessive to reduce the whole thing to a fable whose moral would be that, in order to shelter from inquisitive eyes correspondence whose secrecy is sometimes necessary to conjugal peace, it suffices to leave the letters lying around on one's table, even if one turns them, signifying face down, for that would be a lore which, personally, I would never recommend anyone try, lest he be disappointed at having trusted in it. If there then no other mystery here than incompetence resulting in the failure on the part of the prefect of police, is there not a certain discordance on Dupin's part which we are loath to admit, between the assuredly penetrating remarks, which are not however always absolutely relevant when generalized, with which he introduces us to his method, and the way in which he in fact intervenes? Were we to pursue further our sense that we are being hoodwinked, we might soon begin to wonder whether, from the inaugural scene, which only the rank of the protagonists saves from degenerating into vaudeville, to the descent into ridicule that seems to await the minister at the story's conclusion, it is not, indeed, the fact that everyone is duped which gives us such pleasure here. I would be all the more inclined to think so in that, along with my readers, I would find anew here the definition I once gave, somewhere in passing, of the modern hero, represented by ridiculous feats in situations of confusion. Note: see the function and field of speech and language in psychoanalysis in Eccritus 1966, page 244. But are we ourselves not taken with the imposing bearing of the amateur detective, prototype of a new kind of braggart, as yet safe from the insipidity of our contemporary Superman? That was a joke, yet it makes us note, by way of contrast, so perfect a verisimilitude in this tale that it may be said that truth here reveals its fictional ordering. For this is certainly the pathway along which the reasons for this verisimilitude lead us. Entering first into its procedure we perceive in effect a new drama that I would call complementary to the first, since the first was what is termed a silent drama, whereas the interest of the second plays on the properties of discourse. Note: to completely understand what follows one must reread the short and readily available text of the purloined letter. Indeed, while it is obvious that each of the two scenes of the real drama is narrated in the course of a different dialogue, one must be provided with certain notions brought out in my teaching to realize that this is not done simply to make the exposition more pleasing, but that the dialogues themselves, in the opposite use they make of virtues of speech, take on a tension that make them into a different drama, one which my terminology will distinguish from the first as sustaining itself in the symbolic order. The first dialogue between the prefect of police and Dupin is played out as if it were between a deaf man and one who hears. That is, it represents the veritable complexity of what is ordinarily simplified, with the most confused results in the notion of communication. This example demonstrates how communication can give the impression at which theorists too often stop, of conveying in its transmission but one meaning, as if the highly significant commentary into which he who hears integrates it could be considered neutralized because it is unperceived by he who does not hear. The fact remains that if we only retain the dialogue's meaning as a report, its verisimilitude appears to depend on a guarantee of accuracy. But the report then turns out to be more fruitful than it seems, provided we demonstrate its procedures, as we shall see by confining our attention to the recounting of the first scene. For the double and even triple subjective filter through which the scene comes to us, a narration by Dupin's close friend, whom I will refer to henceforth as the story's general narrator, of the account which the prefect reveals to Dupin, the version the Queen gave him of it, is not merely the consequence of a fortuitous arrangement. If indeed the extremity to which the original narrator is reduced precludes her altering any of the events, we would be wrong to believe the prefect is authorized to lend her his voice here only owing to the lack of imagination for which he holds, as if it were, the patent. The fact that the message is retransmitted in this way assures us of something that is absolutely not self-evident, that the message truly belongs to the dimension of language. Those who are here familiar with my remarks on the subject, specifically those illustrated by the counterexample of the supposed language of bees, in which a linguist can see nothing more than a signaling of the location of objects. In other words, an imaginary function that is simply more differentiated than the others. Note: see Émile Benveniste, Communication animale et langage humaine, Diogenes 1, and my Rome report, The Function and Field of Speech and Language, and Eccritus, 1966, page 297. In English, see Émile Benveniste, Problems in General Linguistics, page 49 to 54. Let me emphasize here that such a form of communication is not absent in man, however evanescent the natural pregiveness (données naturales) may be for him due to the disintegration they undergo through his use of symbols. Something equivalent may in effect be grasped in the communication established between two people in their hatred directed at a common object, with the proviso that this can never occur except in the case of one single object. An object defined by the characteristics of the being that each of the two refuses to accept. But such communication is not transmittable in symbolic form. It can only be sustained in relation to this object. This is why it can bring together an indefinite number of subjects common, ideal, will nonetheless remain irreducibly mediated by an ineffable relation. This excursion is not merely a reminder here of principles distantly addressed to those who tax me with neglecting nonverbal communication. In determining the scope of what discourse repeats, it prepares the question of what symptoms repeat. Thus, the indirect relating of the first scene clarifies the dimension of language, and the general narrator, by redoubling it, hypothetically, adds nothing to it, but this is not at all true for his role in the second dialogue. For the latter is opposed to the first like the poles in language that I have distinguished elsewhere, and are opposed to each other like words to speech. Which is to say that we shift here from the field of accuracy to the register of truth. Now this register, I dare think I need not go back over this, is situated somewhere else altogether, at the very foundation of intersubjectivity. It is situated where the subject can grasp nothing but the very subjectivity that constitutes an other as an absolute. I shall confine my attention in order to indicate its place here, to evoking the dialogue which seems to me to warrant its attribution as a Jewish joke due to the nakedness with which the relation between the signifier and speech appears in the entity which brings it to a head. "Why are you lying to me?" one character exclaims exacerbatedly. Yes, why are you lying to me by saying you're going to Cairo in order to make me believe you're going to Lemberg, when in reality you are going to Cairo? A similar question might be raised in our minds by the torrent of aporias, heuristic enigmas, paradoxes, and even quips presented to us as an introduction to Dupin's method, if the fact that they were confided to us by a would-be disciple did not add some virtue to them, owing to the act of delegation. Such is the unmistakable prestige of legacies, the witness's faithfulness in the wool pulled over the eyes of those who might criticize his testimony. What could be more convincing, moreover, than the gesture of turning one's card face up on the table? It is so convincing that we are momentarily persuaded that the prestidigitator has in fact demonstrated, as he promised he would, how the trick was performed, whereas he has only performed it anew in a purer form. This moment makes us appreciate the supremacy of the signifier in the subject. This is how Dupin operates when he starts with the story of the child prodigy who takes in all of his classmates at the game of even or odd, with the trick of identifying his opponent, concerning which I have shown that he cannot reach the first level of its mental elaboration, namely, the notion of the intersubjective alteration, without immediately being tripped up by the stop of its recurrence. Note: see Eccritus 1966, page 58.